The Japanese preface to the war. Japan intended to spread its economic, political, and military influence throughout the Pacific region as well as the Asian mainland. Japan called this the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To begin this campaign of Pacific influence, Japan needed resources that were near enough Japan to start an initial invasion. Japan utilized Chinese resources while conquering China's land and people in order to build up its military. When Japan started its campaign against China, it utilized a black flag operation. The Mukden incident, which was a railway explosion artificially produced by Japanese operatives, allowed the Japanese to claim casus belli. Japan invaded mainland China at Manchuria and committed horrendous war crimes against the Chinese while pillaging the lands and harvesting resources. The United States took extreme offense to Japan's campaign against nationalist China. Not only was Japan harassing America's ally, but the war also affected American economic prosperity. Japan held the Fifth Imperial Conference July 2, 1941. At this meeting, Japanese leaders decided what to do with troops in Manchuria, whether or not to go to war with the Soviet Union, and how to deal with the UK and the US within the region. Soon after, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull sent a very clear message to Japan in response for its aggressions in the Pacific region and in Asia. The U.S. threatened a seizure of Japanese assets and stopped the flow of oil and much-needed scrap metal to Japan as a sanction. Japan needed to minimize the U.S.'s influence within the region. By doing so, this would greatly cut Japanese losses while allowing it to take hold of strategically important islands. Japan wanted the U.S. Philippines for operationally strategic services to have a naval area of control in order to cut off access between the U.S. and Australia. Because Japan wanted the U.S. to have as little military control and political influence in the South Pacific as it could, Japan wanted to heavily cripple the U.S. Navy while retaliating for the U.S.'s sanctions. Admiral Yamamoto proposed a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Since 1941, the Japanese had been spying on the stronghold and planning its attack. It's important to mention Admiral Kimmel, who played a serious role in American casualties at Pearl Harbor. He unfortunately underestimated Japanese strength and potential for attack and instead wanted to boast American air power to spies. Meanwhile, he wanted to protect American munitions from Japanese saboteurs. This left Pearl Harbor virtually unprotected as all the fighter planes were parked in close proximity and the ammunition was in lockup, with too little time to load any aircraft that did survive bombing raids. The Japanese government okayed the attack on Pearl Harbor mid-summer 1941. By November 2nd, that okay turned into an official green light. November 26, Admiral Nagumo's fleet left Japan, and on early Sunday morning on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft carriers arrived 230 miles off the coast of Oahu, Hawaii. This was where the Japanese launched an airstrike on Pearl Harbor Navy base. For a little 2 hours, the Japanese relentlessly dropped thousands of bombs on Pearl Harbor. 2,043 Americans were killed and 1,178 were injured. 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers had been damaged or destroyed. As well as 188 aircraft were destroyed and 159 damaged. Despite the casualties, Japan was unsuccessful with their true intent. For the American aircraft carriers were not present during the time of the attack. So their effort to get the U.S. out of the way, at least for a little while, was for nothing. However, they did manage to wake the sleeping giant as Admiral Yamamoto concluded. The following day, the United States had declared a war on Japan. The Japanese trained for a year for their attack on America. To customize their weapons for short runs in shallow waters, they modified their equipment by adding wooden fins and other smaller modifications. They utilized 6 aircraft carriers, 420 planes, and removed the radar from their airplanes to avoid detection. The first wave consisted of 180 planes, including torpedo planes, high-level bombers, dive bombers, and fighter planes. The second wave was more dive bombers but no torpedo planes, as well as fighter escorts. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. suffered massive casualties. 2,403 service members were killed. 1,178 members were wounded. 6 U.S. ships were sunk, and 169 aircraft were shot down. Of the 6 sunken ships, 5 were capable of being pulled out of the water, and then 4 were restored and returned to active service. As far as Japanese losses go, 29 airplanes were shot down, 6 midget submarines were sunk, 129 service members were killed, with 1 taken prisoner. The day following the attack, FDR addressed the 77th United States Congress. He gave a speech in which he declared December 7th a date that would live in infamy. Congress nearly unanimously declared war on the Empire of Japan with one nay vote from Representative Janae Rankin of Montana. December 9th, the United States made the shift to war economy in order to provide provisions and weapons for the incoming war. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor not only angered the American people, but also made them incredibly motivated to strike back at the enemy. They would get their day eventually, but until then it was all hands on deck. Men and women alike needed to step up and prepare for war, and they did so with great enthusiasm. The United States converted most of the American production to war production. President Roosevelt wanted to outproduce every other country and show the world, especially Japan, that America was more than able to create superior equipment. In 1942-1943, 180,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, and 55,000 anti-aircraft guns were produced to meet the goals that President Roosevelt had set for the American people. Certain industries had completely transformed, specifically the automobile industry, which had produced more than 3 million cars the year of Pearl Harbor, and only 139 were made during the entire war thereafter. General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Ford Motor Company was tasked with building the B-24 Liberator long-range bomber at such a fast rate that one came off the assembly line every 63 minutes. The United States needed to retaliate against Japan. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, wanted a very aggressive approach in the Pacific, while Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted to play a conservative hand due to the losses incurred at Pearl Harbor. 6 months later, U.S. codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message regarding an imminent attack on Midway. Consequently, the U.S. military sent out false intelligence requesting more water for the island. Upon receiving false intel that the United States forces were undersupplied at Midway, Imperial leaders decided to strike, assuming the Allies would be an easy target. When their navy arrived within the vicinity of the island, they were met with the American fleet, which was accompanied by 3 aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, the American army was fortified on the Midway shores, already prepared for a Japanese invasion. Carriers Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise launched their stock of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter craft, while B-17 bombers launched off the island of Midway in order to distract the opposition. Ultimately, the Japanese lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 292 aircraft, and 2,500 men. The United States in turn lost 1 carrier, a destroyer, 145 aircraft, and lost 307 men. The U.S. had much more firepower than Japan did at the Battle of Midway. Much better strategic tactics, excellent codebreakers, and great false information that lured the Japanese into attack. Additionally, the Japanese made major mistakes at Pearl Harbor by not causing enough damage to the U.S. Navy, meanwhile not holding off on attack to wait for the United States aircraft carriers to return. Overall, Japan was not prepared to fight the U.S. in the Pacific, and the Battle of Midway was a major turning point in the Pacific theater.